There are moments when life seems to pause, not in peace, but in uncertainty. The job you prayed for slips away. The relationship you thought was forever ends without warning. The opportunity you were sure was the one suddenly collapses, leaving behind silence where hope used to live. You stare at the closed door, your heart asking a question heaven hasn't answered yet. Why would God let this happen? But what if the door didn't close to reject you, but to redirect you? What if that silence you're hearing isn't God's absence, it's His construction zone? Because sometimes, before God opens a new door, He has to seal the old one shut so you won't wander back through it. And in that moment of heartbreak, when everything seems lost, He's actually rerouting you to something far greater, something that would have been impossible had that door stayed open. You may not see it yet, but the disappointment that broke you was the divine interruption that saved you. Every unanswered prayer, every no you didn't understand, it wasn't punishment. It was precision. And what happens next when God finally opens the right door will not only surprise you, it will make you thank Him for every one that closed, because one day soon you'll realize He never took anything from you. He was leading you somewhere you couldn't have reached any other way. It began, as many turning points do, in the quiet collapse of something once certain. The air was thick that night, one of those evenings when time seems to stretch between breaths, when every sound in the room feels heavier than usual. She sat at her kitchen table, phone still glowing with the final message. We went in another direction. 6 words that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken ones. For months, she had prayed for this opportunity, believed it was the one God had been shaping her for. The job lined up perfectly with her passion, her timing, her need. Everything had a line door, so she thought. But now the door was closed, abruptly and completely, leaving her in that familiar fog of confusion where faith feels like reaching into the dark for something you can't quite find. She whispered, "Why would you bring me this far just to say no?" The question lingered in the silence. No answer. Just the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars outside, and the quiet ache in her chest. Disappointment is strange, like that tit doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits beside you, silent and uninvited, until it becomes the only thing you can hear. She wanted to pray, but didn't know what to say. Every word felt hollow, every scripture blurred by doubt. It wasn't anger she felt, not yet. It was something deeper, not by people, but by purpose itself. She thought back to all the times she'd heard people say, "If God closes one door, He'll open another." But in that moment, it felt like all the doors were locked and every key she once held had vanished. And yet, there was something subtle, something she couldn't quite explain. A strange stillness in the air, not emptiness, but order. The same kind of silence you feel before dawn breaks. A whisper beneath the noise that seemed to say, "Wait." It wasn't the word she wanted. She wanted movement, resolution, a plan. But God wasn't offering her explanations. He was offering her an invitation to trust the hand she couldn't see. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a divine rerouting, a season not of absence, but of alignment. Because what she couldn't see was what God was already shifting behind the scenes, things that had to move, people who had to exit, opportunities that had to be rearranged for something greater to unfold. That night, she sat there for hours, staring at the ceiling. caught between surrender and resistance. Eventually, exhaustion won. She whispered one last prayer, not polished or poetic, but raw. God, but don't let me miss what you're doing. And with that, she fell asleep. While she slept, heaven moved. It began subtly, a conversation across town, a decision made in a boardroom by someone she'd never met, a delay in a plan that once seemed unrelated, tiny ripples in the fabric of her future that would soon converge into something extraordinary. Because when God closes a door, He doesn't just walk away. He starts preparing the next one. And what she didn't know yet, what none of us often realize in the middle of heartbreaks, that every divine redirection begins with a disruption. Sometimes, God has to stop you before He can launch you. In the following days, she would wrestle with frustration. She would scroll through social media, seeing others celebrating victories she once thought would be hers. She would question if she misheard God, if her faith had been misplaced. And in those questions, her heart would begin to shift, because questions, when surrendered, become classrooms. Each moment of doubt was quietly teaching her something that success never could: how to trust the silence. Because silence is not the absence of God. It's the sound of Him rebuilding everything you thought was over. One morning, about a week later, she woke up with a sense of peace she couldn't explain. Not joy, not excitement, just peace. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstance. The kind that whispers, "You're safe, even here." And that morning, something changed. She opened her Bible and landed, not by plan, but by providence, on Isaiah 22:22. When He opens doors, no one can close them. When He closes doors, no one can open them. She paused. The verse wasn't comforting at first, it was confronting. Because if God had closed that door, then it meant He was protecting her from something she didn't yet see. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to fight the closed door. She simply said, "Okay." That small word was a pivot. The heavens had been waiting for that word. Because sometimes the most powerful prayers aren't loud declarations, they're quiet agreements. That was the moment the trajectory of her story began to shift. Slowly, invisibly, but irrevocably. She had no idea that in just a few weeks, she'd receive a call from someone unexpected. Someone who had been watching her journey, silently inspired by her resilience. Someone who would offer her an opportunity she wasn't even looking for, one that would align perfectly with the very calling she thought she'd lost. But that comes later. For now, all she had was the quiet, the stillness, and a closed door, and yet, that was exactly what God needed to begin. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Every morning carried the same quiet ache, not sharp anymore, but dull, persistent, like the echo of a wound still learning how to heal. She kept her routine, almost mechanically: coffee, prayer, work, silence. Yet beneath it all was that lingering thought: what if I missed God's will? It's a thought many believers know too well, that anxious suspicion that you somehow ruined the perfect plan, that one wrong step or one delayed prayer sent your destiny spiraling away. But the truth, the one God was slowly teaching her, is that you're not powerful enough to derail what He's determined. You can delay your peace, but not His plan. Every night, she'd look at the door she believed should have opened. Every day, she'd feel the temptation to go back, to reapply. to ask for another chance, to try to force what God had already closed. But something inside her resisted. It wasn't resignation, it was revelation. Because closed doors aren't walls, they're guardrails. They protect you from roads that look promising but end in pain. One evening, after a long day, she sat in her living room with the Bible, still open to Isaiah 22:22. She had read it so many times now that the words seemed engraved in her spirit. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Then help me stop knocking where you've already said no." It wasn't an easy prayer. Letting go never is. It's a kind of grief, not just for what you lost, but for what you thought your life would look like by now. But that night, something broke, not in pain, but in release. And sometimes that's what faith really is, not holding on tighter, but letting go completely. Across town, in an office she'd never been to, a man scrolled through a stack of portfolios. He paused at one, her name, her work, her story. Something about it stood out, not the perfection of it, but the perseverance. "There's something different about this one," he said to his assistant. "Keep her name." He didn't know that in that same moment, she was whispering to God, "Even if you never use me the way I dreamed, I'll still trust you." Faith is often born in those unseen intersections, where heaven begins moving while you're too tired to believe anything is moving at all. A week passed, and peace began to take root. Not because anything had changed outwardly, but because she'd finally stopped resisting what God had already resolved. She began to notice small things again, the quiet joy of sunlight on her window, the gentle rhythm of her prayers, the laughter she hadn't realized she'd lost. That's what happens when you stop staring at closed doors. You start seeing the blessings that were waiting in the hallway. Then, one morning, as she sat reading her devotional, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, but answered. "Hi, is this Rachel?" A calm voice asked. "You don't know me, but I came across your work recently. We're starting a new project, and I think you'd be perfect for it." Rachel froze. Her heart began to race. The timing, the tone, the peace in that voice. It didn't feel random. It felt strategic. She stammered out a few words, trying not to sound surprised, but deep down, her spirit knew this wasn't coincidence. This was choreography. As they spoke, details began to unfold. The project was bigger than the one she had lost. Its mission closer to her calling, its scope beyond what she had imagined. And the man, the one who had said, "There's something different about this one," was now offering her the opportunity that would redefine her career. When she hung up, she sat there in silence again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence, the kind that feels like the air right before tears of gratitude. She whispered, "You didn't forget me." And in that whisper, heaven answered back, "I never do." Because that's the mystery of divine timing. It's not delayed, it's designed. She didn't know that God had been aligning this new door long before the old one ever closed. That every no was making room for a yes that wouldn't just fit her resume, but her purpose. And that's the difference. Closed doors protect your plans. Open doors reveal your calling. That night, she sat on her balcony under the soft hum of city lights. The world felt different, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she had. She realized that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as disappointments. She smiled, eyes closed, letting the evening breeze wrap around her like a quiet promise. But she didn't know that her story wasn't done, not even close, because the door God had just opened would lead her into a chapter she never could have planned, one that would challenge her, grow her, and prove once and for all that what God begins, no one can stop. And that's where the story shifts, from restoration to revelation, because once you walk through a door God opens, you don't just find opportunity, you find purpose that multiplies. The new beginning didn't look the way she expected it to, not grand or dramatic, but quiet and deliberate, like God Himself had tiptoed her into a new season without letting her realize she'd already stepped into it. The project started small, a simple collaboration, a trial period, yet something about it felt different. The atmosphere, the people, even the conversations carried a kind of peace that didn't come from effort but alignment. She could feel God in the details, the timing of the meetings, the encouragement in a stranger's words, the way every challenge seemed to turn into confirmation rather than resistance. That's how you know when a door is truly opened by God. It doesn't strain your soul, it strengthens it. Trauma from the closed door lingered like a shadow. She found herself afraid to fully trust the new. What if it fell apart too? What if this door also closed before she was ready? She didn't realize that fear of new blessings is one of the enemy's most subtle tactics to make you question what God has already confirmed. One afternoon, as she sat reviewing her notes for the project, her mentor, an older woman of deep faith, called. "Rachel," she said gently, "you're holding your breath again." Rachel laughed softly, though tears gathered behind her eyes. "I guess I'm just scared to believe it's real." Her mentor smiled through the phone. "You're not the only one who's ever felt that way. Remember Peter? He almost drowned trying to walk toward Jesus because he looked at the waves instead of the one who called him. Faith doesn't fail because of storms. It fails because we forget who sent us into them." Rachel sat still, eyes closed, letting the words sink in. "You're not walking through this new door alone," her mentor continued. "God doesn't open doors and then walk away. He stays on the other side, waiting to walk you through." That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. The words echoed in her mind. He stays on the other side. She went to her journal and wrote, "Lord, teach me to walk through open doors without dragging my fear through them." Something shifted again. She realized that trusting God once wasn't enough. It was a daily surrender. Because faith isn't a one-time decision, it's a rhythm. Weeks turned into months. The project grew beyond expectation. What began as a small collaboration became something far-reaching. Her work began impacting people she'd never meet, lives touched, hearts moved, testimonies rising quietly in the background. And through it all, she could see the thread, how everything that had broken her before had built her for this. The delay, the silence, the rejection, all of it had trained her spirit, stretched her patience, sharpened her ear to hear God clearly. She smiled one morning while reading her emails. An old message popped up from the company that had once rejected her. They had heard about her success and wanted to reconnect. She laughed out loud, not in arrogance, but in awe. "You're funny, God," she whispered. "That's what happens when you stay faithful in the hallway. God makes sure that the very doors that closed on you become proof of His timing." Later that day, While driving home, Rachel turned off the radio and let her mind drift into prayer. "Thank you for the no," she said quietly. "I didn't understand it then, but I do now." And in that stillness, she sensed the presence of God, not as a voice from above, but as a peace within. It was as though heaven whispered back, "I closed that door not to punish you, but to position you. Because if you had walked through it, you would have settled for less than what I built you for." Her eyes welled with tears again, not of sadness this time, but gratitude, because the greatest miracles often come disguised as detours. That night, she sat on her balcony again, the same place she once prayed through heartbreak, the same stars above her, but now they looked different, brighter, closer somehow. She realized the same sky that watched her cry had also watched her rise, and then she saw it, the pattern. Every time she thought something ended, something new had quietly begun. Every time she thought God had gone silent, he had simply gone strategic. She whispered, "You were never late. You were just aligning me." And that realization changed everything, because when you finally see that every closed door was grace in disguise, disappointment loses its power forever. From that day on, Rachel began to walk differently, not cautiously, but confidently. She stopped asking God for explanations and started asking for endurance. She stopped begging for signs and started recognizing his fingerprints in the details. And for the first time, she understood what it meant when Scripture says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me." Because now she could look back and see goodness had always been following her. She just hadn't turned around long enough to notice. What she didn't know yet was that this wasn't just about a job, or a project, or a career. This open door was only the beginning of a divine chain reaction, one that would soon ripple into every corner of her life. Because when God opens a door, he doesn't just open it for opportunity, he opens it for overflow. And Rachel was about to learn that the same hand that closes a door can also open the floodgates of heaven. It's strange how God's timing feels slow until it suddenly feels unstoppable. The same days that once crawled with confusion now raced forward with purpose. Rachel's life began to shift in ways she hadn't imagined, not just in her work, but in her heart, her relationships, her faith. Everything that once felt scattered was beginning to make sense, piece by piece, like a divine mosaic slowly coming into focus. She used to think purpose was a destination, a single open door that you walk through once and everything aligns. But now she understood it was a process, a series of divine interruptions, redirections, and hidden setups that only make sense when you look backward. One evening, months later, Rachel stood in a small conference hall filled with people. The project she had joined had grown into something much larger, an organization that inspired thousands. She was now leading a presentation about resilience and faith in waiting seasons. As she spoke, she could see faces light up, people who were in the same emotional space she had once occupied. The hallway between a closed door and an unseen promise, she told them. "I used to think God's silence meant he was absent. Now I know his silence is often the sound of strategy. When you can't hear him, it's because he's moving things that don't make noise." The room grew still. You could feel something holy in that silence, not emptiness, but awe. After the event, a young woman approached her. Tears filled her eyes as she said, "I was about to quit. I thought God had forgotten me. but hearing your story, it feels like he sent me here tonight just to remind me that he hasn't." Rachel smiled softly, recognizing the same desperation she once carried. "He hasn't forgotten you," she said gently. "He's just setting the stage. Sometimes the darkest part of the night is when the scene is changing." They hugged, and for a brief moment, it was as though two timelines met. One healed, one still healing, and both reflected the mercy of the same God. When Rachel drove home that night, she rolled down her window and let the wind brush against her face. She thought of that night at her kitchen table, the rejection, the silence, the tears, and realized it had all been sacred, because what had felt like an ending had actually been a commissioning. She whispered, "You closed the wrong door to open the right one." And for the first time, she didn't just believe it. She felt it. As the months passed, more doors opened, not because she chased them, but because she stayed faithful in the one God had already given her. Opportunities multiplied, influence grew, and her story began reaching people far beyond her circle. But through it all, she never forgot the truth that had rebuilt her faith. Closed doors aren't rejection, they're redirection. One quiet morning, Rachel sat by her window with her Bible open, coffee steaming beside her. The same verse that once confronted her, Isaiah 22:22, stared back. She underlined it again, this time with a smile. When he opens doors, no one can close them. She paused, then added a note in the margin. And when he closes them, no one can force them open, not even me, outside. The sunrise painted the sky with gold, the same color as the light she once saw through that closed door. Only now, she realized it had never been the light behind the door that mattered. It had always been the light within her that God was protecting. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She didn't need to chase, strive, or prove anything anymore. She had learned the rhythm of trust, to move when he says move, to rest when he says wait, and to worship in both, because the same hand that closes one chapter also writes the next. And somewhere, in the unseen corners of her story, another door was already forming, one she couldn't imagine yet, but one heaven had already prepared. As she closed her eyes, a quiet peace filled the room, the kind that says, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." And maybe that's the most miraculous thing about divine timing. It not only restores what was lost, it redeems how you see waiting itself. So, if you ever find yourself staring at a closed door, wondering where God went, remember Rachel's story. Remember that silence doesn't mean stillness, that endings are often disguised beginnings, and that the very door that's shut in your face might just be the reason you finally see the hand of God at work, because every no in the kingdom is preparation for a greater yes, and when it comes, it will fit so perfectly, so completely, that you'll understand why every other door had to close. Rachel did, and now so will you.